Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, everyone. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces. The walk across the bridge was fabulous, and being in community with so many amazing folks and getting in a little cardio was a great time. Can everyone hear me okay? As a man born and raised in Alabama, it is indeed a pleasure to be a part of this event honoring the 60-year anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March. A march that will be a catalyst to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, giving Black folks access to the ballot. A march under the leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that brought together civil rights leaders, religious leaders, organizers, and activists from around the country to the small town of Selma to join together to fight for justice and equality. A march that will come to be known as Bloody Sunday. Known as Bloody Sunday because blood, tears, and life were lost in the efforts of Alabama to get African Americans the right to cast their vote. An inalienable right promised to all, like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I don't want to hold you here too long, but there are three things that I want to talk about today. First, I want to take a moment to talk about Alabama and the Selma to Montgomery March. This event today is called Remembering Selma, and most importantly, we need to talk about the significance of this moment in history. Next, I want to talk about how the Selma to Montgomery March would not have happened if not for integrated advocacy. Black folks, we cannot do this by ourselves. We all have a role in where we go from here. Some of you may not be aware of the legacy New Hampshire holds in the March on Selma. I want to talk about that legacy, and I want to talk about how that legacy tells an important story about how everyone must play a part in justice for all as a reality. And then finally, I would like to talk about your voting rights today. The Voting Rights Act will be an important outcome of the events of Selma. But the right to vote is something that folks would like to take away from us. And in some places, this is working. And we cannot sit back and allow this stripping away of something so important and something so precious. So let's start with Alabama. I'm honored to be standing here today, a product of Alabama. As the song says, my home's in Alabama, no matter where I lay my head. Yes, my home's in Alabama, Southern born and Southern bred. I want to talk about the march from Selma to Montgomery, but I feel I cannot talk about the march without talking about the conditions for Black folks in Alabama in 1965. But I cannot talk about the conditions for Black folks in 1965 unless we talk about Jim Crow. So I feel I have to start with a little bit of a history lesson.
A little bit louder.
So I feel I have to start with a little bit of a history lesson.
Yeah.
How many folks in here actually know about Jim Crow or what Jim Crow is? That's amazing to see. Jim Crow was a system of laws in the U.S. that enforced racial segregation following the Civil War. For my undergraduate studies, I received a bachelor's in history and a bachelor's in political science. And do you know how many things I learned in college that were never mentioned in any history class that I took in high school? I didn't learn about Jim Crow in high school. I didn't learn about Japanese internment camps in high school. I didn't learn about the Tuskegee experiment in high school. There is a reason why bans concepts is a thing. There is a reason why some folks want to erase certain lessons from the classroom. We have a harsh history, and many don't want folks to know about it. and they don't want their kids to know about it either. Lots of folks think that things must have been great for Black folks following emancipation. Well, truth be told, for most, the Jim Crow era was worse than slavery. At least when Black folks were property and used for free labor, our lives had some value. Life may have been miserable, but you had life. Following the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, the lives for folks that were formerly enslaved went from bad to worse. Lynchings became sport that drew crowds of white families, parents and children, anxious to see dead Black bodies swinging from trees. You see, when we were enslaved, we made people rich. With freedom, we were now seen as bothersome, or we were seen as threatening. Coming from Alabama, I am acutely aware of our history. It is a history of bigotry, ignorance, and the relentless persecution of Black folks. It is a state that is proud to wave the Confederate flag and brag that it once housed the capital of the Confederacy. Now that Black folks were free, Alabama wanted to make sure that these newly emancipated individuals had no access to resources. Laws were passed all over the South denying African Americans access to housing, denying access to education, denying access to jobs, and denying access to the right to vote. Black people had no power, but eventually came to the realization, if we could just vote, maybe we could get folks in power that could change some things. In 1963, Black folks in Selma started organizing voter registration drives. And in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. This legally ended segregation. But in Alabama, nothing actually changed. If anything, tensions between the races increased. It was during this time of increased racial tension in Selma when Dr. Martin Luther King was invited to help with the voter registration efforts. Like many southern states, Alabama invoked literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses that will prohibit Blacks from the ballot. Please know that these restrictions were only applicable to Black folks. And those few Black people who worked hard to evade these loopholes and gain the right to vote, they were greeted at polling places with hatred and violence. In February of 1965, in a town just outside of Selma, Jimmy Lee Jackson was attending a peaceful protest calling for the access for the right to vote for African Americans. He was shot and killed by a state trooper. I want to honor and remember the names of folks on whose shoulders I stand. Those individuals who sacrificed their lives so that I can have the liberties I have today. So I ask you to say his name. Please say Jimmy Lee Jackson.
Jimmy Lee Jackson.
Once again, Jimmy Lee Jackson.
Jimmy Lee Jackson.
And because I believe in the power of three, Jimmy Lee Jackson.
Jimmy Lee Jackson.
It was after the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson that the outraged folks in Selma started to organize the dramatic and lengthy march to Montgomery, calling for the unhindered right to vote for Black folks in the state. Selma to Montgomery is no short trip. I Googled it. It is 51 miles.
Ooh.
51 miles is a short trip by car, but it is a long walk for your rights. The march was scheduled for March 7th, and somehow state troopers in Selma found out about the march and were determined for it not to happen. We all know that it became known as Bloody Sunday. The march was supposed to start on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and the nearly 600 folks participating in the march were met with state troopers and a posse of folks from the county armed with batons and tear gas. The violence was savage and it was swift. One of the event's organizers, Amelia Boynton, was beat unconscious. And because of the violence, the march was cut short. News reporters were able to capture pictures and video of the peaceful marchers brutally attacked by law enforcement, and the images quickly spread nationally. The realization of what Black people in Alabama were enduring just to gain the right to vote brought all eyes in the U.S. on Selma. Suddenly there was sympathy, and the focus of rights to vote for Blacks had captured the attention of the White House. While a second attempt at a march was unsuccessful, a third attempt to march on March 21 happened. And with the assistance of FBI and federal marshals, because Alabama's Governor George Wallace refused to help, with the assistance of FBI and federal marshals, thousands of marchers would walk, averaging 10 miles a day, until they reached Montgomery. They would reach Montgomery on March 24th, and the next day, 25,000 people staged a demonstration on the steps of Alabama's Capitol. This is the same Capitol where Governor Wallace declared segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Later that same year, President Lyndon B. Johnson seized the opportunity created by Selma and would pass the Voting Rights Act, undoing all barriers of Jim Crow and opening up the right to vote for African Americans. Now, while I've talked about Alabama, I want to take a moment to talk about the Granite State. There's an interesting story in New Hampshire that ties it to the legacy of the events of Selma. And that connection can be traced to the city of Keene. I'd often get asked the question, how did you end up in New Hampshire? Well, the answer to that question is this. I met my husband in college. We both attended Detroit State University. He is from Keene, New Hampshire, and received the track scholarship to go to school in Alabama. We met at a fraternity party, and after college, we spent a few years in Arizona. And after Arizona, we decided we should move closer to his family and made the decision to come back to New Hampshire to be closer to his parents who still resided in Keene. Well, back in 1965, when Dr. King was organizing voter registration drives in Selma and was trying to get national attention on the civil rights efforts in the state, needing as much help as he could get with these efforts, he would make a call to action, trying to recruit students and clergy from around the country to come and help. A young seminary student from Keene, New Hampshire, by the name of Jonathan Daniels, answered that call. Jonathan wanted to be a part of the civil rights work being done in the South and had a desire to work with Dr. King. Selma was his catalyst, igniting him to join in the movement and move to Alabama. Although he missed the bus that would get him to Alabama in time for the March on Selma, he would not be dissuaded and still moved to Alabama to join in the fight for justice. He would spend several months organizing in Selma and would eventually head down to Fort Deposit, Alabama to help with picketing of some of the whites-only establishments. It was common for protesters to be arrested, and this happened to Jonathan and his group of protesters as well. After day 6 in jail, they would finally be released. Upon release, many of the protesters stood outside the jailhouse waiting for transportation in the warm Alabama sun in August. While waiting, Jonathan and a few others, thirsty from the heat and humidity, decided to go to a nearby store to purchase some cold sodas. In their efforts to enter the store, a deputy holding a shotgun branded his gun to shoot a young 17-year-old Ruby Seals. Jonathan pushed Ruby to the ground and caught the full blast of the gun, and he was killed instantly. Upon learning of Jonathan's death, Dr. King would say, "One of the most heroic Christian deeds of which I have heard in my entire ministry, was performed by Jonathan Daniels. Please join me in saying his name, Jonathan Daniels.
Jonathan Daniels.
Jonathan Daniels.
Jonathan Daniels.
Jonathan Daniels.
Jonathan Daniels.
One of my favorite mantras is, this joy that I have inside, the world didn't give it to me, and the world can't take it away. Well, I'm going to paraphrase and say also, this racism problem that we have in this country, Black folks didn't give it to us. Black folks are not going to be able to take it away. For many of the folks jailed in Alabama for peaceful protesting, it was the American Civil Liberties Union assisting in getting them out of jail following their arrest. While the ACLU may have a diverse group of people working for them now, this is not how the organization looked back in the 1960s. Back in the 1960s, these were good troublemakers, as my brother John Lewis would call them, and were mostly white attorneys who realized something needed to be done, and they had the means to help. Activism, organizing, political action, we cannot be separate in our efforts for justice. Black folks cannot be the only ones screaming, Black Lives Matters. Women cannot be the only ones at protest rallies for reproductive rights. My twin brother is a paraplegic. I would dishonor him if I turned a deaf ear on the plight of folks with physical challenges. Cisgendered folks have to stand up for transgender folks. And all must aid in the criminalization of immigrants and the criminalization of the unhoused. We cannot turn a blind eye when it comes to the needs of others, unless you're expecting no one to show up when you're in need. I don't want to hold you here much longer, I'm almost done. I want you to know that your right to vote is still under attack. 60 years ago, President Johnson signed the Voter Rights Act into law. Over the course of the last decade, much of the power of the Voting Rights Act has been diminished. Yes, Black folks in Alabama gained the right to vote, but the state of Alabama would then draw district lines with an intentional effort to dilute any Black political power. It's working. Redlining and redistricting have long been tools of folks that want to weaken your voting power. In recent years, we have seen efforts where folks want to end mail-in ballots, reduce the number of polling places, or increase requirements needed at polls for folks to vote, all in an effort to eliminate your ability to cast your ballot. And these efforts are specifically targeting people of color. We have to stay vigilant and engaged, and I know that this may be tough in this moment, but our livelihood depends on us staying energized and connected. Our power depends on collaboration, creativity, and perseverance as we fight an uphill battle. And if we don't come together in unison and put efforts toward others that may not share our identity or share community with us, our freedom will be at stake. I work for the ACLU in New Hampshire. We are fighting for the civil liberties of all. We were the first organization in the country to file a lawsuit against our current sitting president after he signed his first right to We issued a lawsuit last year trying to protect trans youth who just wanted the right to play soccer. We are doing our best to protect the liberties of the most vulnerable. My ask is that you do all you can do for your community, but recognize that your community is made of immigrants. It's made of folks that speak English as a second language. It's made of folks that are unhoused. Your community is made of folks who may need the right to access an abortion. Your community is made of folks who are trans. And when you cast your votes for folks that see these individuals as constituents. I want to close with 2 quotes from Dr. King. First, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. And second, a quote which I find so appropriate as we're honoring and remembering Selma. We cannot walk alone. As we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back.
Does anyone